I guess it was about 3 weeks ago. I was mentioning about our percentage of class attendance and how many we had, but how low the percentage was compared, figuring how many we had on the road. And that day we had 81. And I get excited. If we get 100 here, there's no telling. We may not even make it to church service sometime. We just get really excited. But I can remember in 1977, which has been a day or two ago, about 40 years ago, we started with 3 couples. And it's changed, evolved, and rolled. And we were the second couples class at Oakland. And then a few years later, they took 2 and made 5, and now they've got it up to a dozen, I think. I don't know how many couples class there are, but I'm glad that we need them. I'm glad that you're here. We're going to take just a few minutes and just run through 2 or 3 things from last week, because we had testimonies last week, and they were a blessing to me. Testimonies is the way we grow. If we don't share testimonies back and forth, Batterson says we don't share testimonies back and forth, a part of us just kind of shrivels up, and pretty soon it just dies and it's gone. So I always need to hear from you, and I'm going to share a couple things with you in just a moment. From last week, Mary is at front and center, and Gabriel confronts Mary, and we know the story, as he intended and did use her to fulfill the greatest promise maybe in the scriptures of the whole covenant, and that was the coming of Jesus. And she is the one who's going to give birth, and we know that, and without that we have nothing. That's foundational. There's some things around the peripheral of what we talk about and say we believe that we can kind of take it or leave it, but that's one thing that you have to take. Young girl, poor family, God used her miraculously. That's what he did. And he's still doing it. A lot of us are not young anymore, but we may come from a rough background, poor. It doesn't make any difference. Mary's question was, how could God use me? Well, a lot of other people have asked the same question. You've probably asked the same question of yourself, but certainly he did. And so Mary's identity became faith. She just responded with faith. She didn't have any idea what she was responding to. She was kind of like Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. He go into a country and say he didn't even know what country it was, and certainly didn't know where it was. So at the start of this portion of the New Testament, we see a young woman, and I don't know how old do you think she was, probably? Any thoughts? Pardon? Not over mid-teens. Many people think 13 or 14. This guy says we see a young woman of faith, and she didn't even know she was a young woman of faith until the pressure came. And it said that she just accepted the difficult call. She didn't know anything about it. She's almost a perfect example of faith, I think. So that's where we were last week. And here was one part that came out in Luke chapter 1, verse 50. The scripture says, his mercy is from generation to generation on those who fear him. And the author said this, and I just can't go by without getting this and sharing it with you. Mercy, by definition, is something we need the most when we deserve it the least. Mercy is something we need the most when we deserve it the least. It just doesn't get any better than that. That's the foundation. A lot of other good things. I hope that you've read it out of your book. Today's lesson is actually talking about the birth a little bit. We're at that time. We're not at his birth time of the year. We're close to his death time of the year, what we commonly call Good Friday and Easter. And this author says Jesus' humiliation is brought out in this. We're in Luke chapter 2. This was a fascinating statement to me. Jesus' humiliation in terms of his death is something we hear about. I mean, hanging naked on a cross in front of everybody to see, everybody who was at Golgotha that day. But look at his birth circumstances. We have no idea. All we got's paintings and pictures of what his birth was like. But this guy said, Luke's portrayal of Jesus' birth sets the tone for the rest of his life. Humiliating experiences. He was never exalted but by anyone but his Father. And so the great humility was where he was born. It set the pace for the rest of his life. I circled this the other night when I was looking at this. Luke focused on the poverty of Jesus' birth. There wasn't anything fancy. That you can go from there up, but if you're up here, you can't come down. In other words, his birth being revealed to the shepherds, and we talked about this a little bit in our Wednesday night class. There wasn't anything lower than being a night shift shepherd. We mentioned that, I think, a couple weeks ago on Wednesday night. And that's who Jesus' birth was first announced to. The shepherds were low on the totem pole as far as their job. They weren't in the upper echelon, so to speak. Lesson 3. If you can parallel it to what I'm saying, you're good. So it puts the bee on us today to make sure that if we're going to do the same thing that the angels did, that we may have to go some places that we don't care anything about going and deal with some people that we think maybe are below us, but there isn't anybody. Well, none of us are up the ladder we may think we are. This guy says the wealthy, the educated, and sometimes the most religious miss out on what's going on. And I asked my wife, I said, Elaine, of those three groups, the wealthy, the educated, there's nothing wrong with being either one of those. Which one is going to miss Christ probably? And she said the last one, the religious. Religion is man's attempt to get to God. Christianity is God's successful way of getting Jesus to us. So, we're just going to hit 2 or 3 things. In the middle of now Luke's take on this is going to be a whole lot different. When you read Matthew and you read Luke, you're thinking you're reading 2 completely different stories, but God uses us where we are. Matthew and Luke were 2 completely different men. And even though it's inspired by the Holy Spirit, those 2 men are speaking from their hearts. The author said, in this birth situation, I don't know what the stable looked like, I imagine in our minds, it's a whole lot worse than what we think it is. I was raised on a farm. I know kind of what a stable looks like, and I pretty well know what our cow barn where we milked was, and I knew what the horse barn looked like, and I knew what it was to put hay in the loft in the summer and then feed it down, put it down in the chute in the winter. Matthew tells us that they at least had a place that was warm and dry. The scripture said there's no room for them in the inn. I doubt, and that's one translation, I doubt seriously if there was such thing as an inn. But no, it makes no difference. A lot of people, had places where people could stay, but anyway, it was all full. It didn't make any difference. And the scripture says that they're warm and safe for a little while, but later on, because of Herod, they're going to be fleeing for their lives. Jesus' life was always in danger, but he didn't die until God said it's time. I like this. Somewhere, and I know we're kind of leaning toward Christmas here in this story, but I went back later because it's got pencil. It's underlined in pen. I don't underline in pencil. But I went back later, and as I was reading, I tried to reread it and say, have I got this flow in my mind right? Here we are struck with the reality of God becoming human and being born in a stable. In my mind, Tammy, in my mind, I would think it would be different than that. Have you ever thought about that? The circumstances surrounding Jesus' birth and where Mary physically was when she gave birth to the one who died for me. we just thought, I would think it'd be a little bit nicer than that, Floyd. It just seems like it would. But he says, and I like this, because this hits you and me right where we live. There's no apologies made in the Scripture for the conditions. Don't you make any apologies for the conditions that you find yourself in as you're trying to get a home started or a marriage started or whatever. I like this. It was the best that Joseph and Mary could provide. If it's the best, it's good enough for right now. It may change later. It may get worse later. I never thought about that. It was the best that Mary and Joseph could provide. They got there. They're under ridicule anyway. She and Joseph are not married. She's expecting a baby any day. They're as far as from here to Shannon, from where they're going, where the baby's going to be born. It was the best they could provide. Only by the grace of God did they even get there. But think how appropriate the scene is. The angels are telling the shepherds what's going on. And then later on, the angel told the shepherds his purpose in being there. Now, I put a note out beside this, Craig. This author said, now picture you're out here shepherding these sheep. I don't know how big the area was. It wasn't a fenced off pasture with electric fence around, I can guarantee you that. The angel told the shepherds he had come to proclaim the gospel. Some things do not change. When the angel told the shepherds he had come to proclaim the gospel, he was telling us that's our job too. I don't think I've seen an angel lately. I saw someone who thought they were an angel one time. But our calling is the same, is to proclaim the gospel. Our callings do the same thing the angel did. I just don't see any difference in this. Everything's exciting. Everything's happening real quick. The shepherds leave the scene. They leave the baby who someday is going to allow himself to be conquered so we can be conquerors. And I underline this. Luke just kind of leaves us alone with Mary. If you're reading in Luke 2, 8 through 20, you kind of get the heartbeat of this young, let's just say 14-year-old girl. I don't know how old she was. She must have been puzzled to a certain extent. Poor girl had not been around the hierarchy a lot, kind of like us. But said she must have been puzzled. This is his thoughts about this, Keith, and I kind of like this. She must have been puzzled that there was no group of royal officials to greet her son at his birth, only an humble bunch of shepherds. I'm still kind of amazed at that myself, Alan. I kind of wonder about that. But God knows what He's doing. He knew what He was doing then. He knows what He's doing today. And He also knows what He's doing tomorrow, because He's already at tomorrow. We're not there yet, but He is. Now, when you read Matthew, in the latter part of this, you go into Matthew, you're going to find a whole different take on it. You're not going to be talking about the shepherds. You're going to be talking about the wise men who showed up quite a bit later. Here's what this guy says about the wise men. A study of the wise men, if you're into in-depth study, will take you a few hours. Don't allocate 30 minutes to study about the wise men. Here's what he says. Unlike the lowly shepherds, the magi, or wise men, were an elite political force who had exercised authority since Daniel's time. They were astrologers as well as astronomers, men who studied the writings of the religions of the ancient world, including the Hebrew Scriptures. It makes sense then. Now, they did this all the time. They're on top of what's happening. I would not be surprised to hear that one of the wise men had a computer back in his office. It makes sense then that they would have followed the star to Jerusalem. Numbers 24:17, I didn't even know this was here, says, I see him, but not now. I perceive him, but not near. A star will come from Jacob, and a scepter will arise from Israel. Now take that verse and dig on it for about an hour with some commentaries. How many do we say there were? Well, I'm guessing, this guy guesses, other commentary guesses, there may have been 30 or 40 of them with a Persian army with them. we know where we get the three from. We say that at Christmas, well, gold and frankincense and myrrh. We don't have any idea how much gold and frankincense and myrrh they brought. But by the time they get there, Mary and Joseph are not at the manger. They're living in a house by that time. And they were supposed to, you remember they were supposed to report back to Herod, and they never saw Herod again. Great story. But they were part of the elite and part of the educated, and God brings those people in at the right time. You may have been born in a family like that. Most of us weren't. And it may hold you back a little bit from getting saved. But it's because we let us, because we do not listen. The guy says, when they bowed to the new king of the Jews, it was as if their faraway kingdoms from Persia were bowing, foreshadowing the day when every knee would bow. They had their purpose. They had their place. They were important in that place. So what do I conclude from this? Well, I'll conclude one or two things when there's probably a million, that I should learn. Like the shepherds, we must be drawn out of the daily drudgery of our lives, the normalcy, and realize that the good news has been revealed to us. I don't care if you're among the elite or if you're on the same level as a shepherd. It doesn't make any difference to God. He knows what we are. He knows my heart. I don't even know my heart. The heart is deceitful and desperately wicked. Who can know it? Jeremiah 17:9 says. So, because I've got a couple other things to say, we've run through just the highlights of a couple lessons. Listen to this paragraph. At the same time, now we're talking about today, we're talking about March the 19th, 2017. We're not talking back there in 4 or 6 BC, whatever it was, I don't know. At the same time, we are men and women who are imaginably rich in contrast to the rest of the world. You say you're not rich. You say, I haven't got money that so-and-so's got. We're not talking about money. He says, we have been gifted with an education that most of the people in the rest of the world could hardly dream of. We have some people in here who have bachelor's degrees and master's degrees or doctor's degrees and so forth. Yet with all of our possessions and education, we must acknowledge, along with the wise men, that something vital is missing. And that something, whatever it is, that's lacking in your life and my life, can only be found at the feet of Jesus. Can't be found anywhere else. There's nothing wrong with the other. There's old Rob, he did come back. I kind of jumped his case a couple weeks ago, but he did come back. I'm glad. Rob's my friend. No matter how you started, we all started the same way. Mom gave birth to us. I was the first of 4, and it wasn't but a few months till she and Dad decided they could do better. I am 15 months older than my next sister. 15 months. So Mom and Dad decided in about 6 months we could do better than that. And I think they did. I tied for 48th in my class rank. My sister was valedictorian. So they were right. They were right. But it takes us coming to the feet of Jesus. I don't care. I don't care what your situation is. We have to come to the feet of Jesus. And why is that? Because life is real and life goes on. And it sounds good when you're laughing. I don't come with the intention of making you laugh. I'm 100 miles from being a comedian. But I've got something I want to share with you. I know it's 20 after. We're supposed to be in the middle of the Sunday school lesson. You're here and I'm here, and the main thing is Jesus is here. This is I have no idea where I got this. Somebody seen it. I do not even have page 1 of it. This is when emails were just flying around everywhere. And I'm certainly not going to share all of them with you, but I think this is funny. I dug this out of my drawer down there where I got all my junk. I got 2 drawers that's about this deep, and it's full of notes and so forth. And it says, changing a light bulb the Christian way. Now this kind of fits me since I do that occasionally. How many Christians does it take to change a light bulb? Charismatic, only 1. Their hands are already in the air. You know who I thought about, don't you? Pentecostal takes 10. 1 to change the bulb, and 9 to pray against the spirit of darkness. Presbyterians doesn't take anybody. The lights will just go off and on at predestined times. Don't worry about that. If you don't know anything about what the Presbyterians believe, well, don't be critical here. Roman Catholic doesn't take any, because the Roman Catholics just use candles. No, we'll get to the Baptists. I'm going to skip it right now. Episcopalians. I had an aunt that was Episcopalian. Never did have any idea what that they believed. This may give some a light to it. It takes 3. It takes 3. 1 to call the electrician. 1 to talk about how much better the old one was, and 1 to mix the drinks. I just laid it out like it is. You can take what you want to. Mormons, it takes 5. 1 man to change the bulb, and 4 wives tell him how to do it. Man, aren't you glad you just got one? Hallelujah. God's plan is the best plan. God's plan is the best plan. And then you get into some. I am very familiar with Methodism. We were in the Methodist church when I got saved, and I'm going to tell you some more about that in just a few minutes. But I'm very familiar. We've been in a lot of Methodist worship services. And got a friend that's a Methodist pastor, and got some good friends that are Methodist folks that know Jesus. Here's the Methodist, and this is on target. I guarantee you it's on target. And I think it's funny because I got a little insight on this. Methodist, it's undetermined. Whether your light is bright, dull, or completely out, you are loved. Love's a big word in the Methodist church. You can be a light bulb, turnip bulb, tulip bulb, but not dual filament. I figured out what that meant. Church-wide lighting service is planned for Sunday. Bring bulb of your choice in a covered dish. That's Methodism. That's good. And I'm not going to say it's all bad. I'm going to say it's all bad. Nazarene takes 6. I don't know what you know about Nazarenes. I know very little. It says it needs 1 woman to change the bulb and 5 men to review the church lighting policy. The Amish, what's a light bulb? Now the Baptist. Now the Baptist. Here we go, Mark. Here's the Baptist take on changing the light bulb. It takes at least 15. It takes 1 to change the bulb, 3 committees to approve the change, and decide who brings the potato salad and the fried chicken. That's the Baptist, and that's right on target. Right on target. I thought that was good. I drug that out, and I got some other things I drag out from time to time, and I'm old enough I can't remember when I told it the last time, so you may get something every once in a while that you just heard a few months ago. Now I've got 5 minutes. "45 years ago tonight, I met Jesus. It was March the 19th, 1972, and it was down at the Methodist Church in Bruce, down below Tupelo. Most everyone here knows where Bruce is. I think God had spoken to me when I was a youngster at the Christian church up in Missouri at 12. When I was 16, I walked the aisle with a bunch of other people. And I was in a church that they immersed, at least, but I wasn't saved. Nothing changed about my life. I didn't sense any change, wasn't under any type of conviction. I could have been saved that night. I could have been saved at 12. Life rocked on and started going downhill to some degree. This gal on the front row was mighty little girl then, and probably doesn't remember anything about it, but we went down there that night, and not in the church service, but before the church service even started that night. It was kind of a layman service of some kind. Marty and Everett were there that night, Floyd, and Elaine and I. I remember the pastor's name was Williams. That's all I remember about that part. But there were some laymen going to be sharing that night. But during a little prayer meeting about 10 or 15 minutes before 7, and the service was to start at 7, we met back in the pastor's office for prayer, and I don't even know what I was doing in there except I needed to hear Paul Lowe pray. Saw Paul the other day, looking good. When the prayer was over, Paul prayed for those that was going to be sharing that night. It was about 5 or 10 minutes to 7, I guess. I don't know. I can't. That's unimportant. They all headed toward the sanctuary, and I went out the pastor's private entrance, the back, where you could come in without disturbing folks. And I went out back. And Craig, if I had any idea what was going to happen, I'd been all excited about it. But I knew I was under conviction. I didn't know what you called it, but I knew I didn't feel good. I was borderline sick in my stomach. God was speaking to me. I was not raised in a church. I'd heard my first personal testimony about somebody knowing Jesus about 2 or 3 months before that. And then I heard another one, and that was the kicker. God used a personal testimony to get my attention. I don't think till that night, those nights, I don't think I'd ever heard the word saved in my life. I'd never heard anybody explain the Roman road. Didn't know God's plan for me. Didn't even know God had a plan for me. But I fell under conviction. I went out there and leaned on that old air conditioning unit, and they hadn't, of course it was March. Some of the old grass was dead, but it was still up around the unit. I remember leaning on that air conditioning unit and saying, I wished I had a tape of exactly what I said that night. I thought I was out there by myself, but it wasn't. But I know that night I gave up on me. And what I knew, I just laid myself down. Then after the service that night, I went to Everett Baker. Everett and Marty were instrumental in getting us into the same church they were at that time. And I went to Everett and I said, something happened tonight, but I don't know what you call it. That turkey started laughing out loud, Floyd. I didn't know what had happened to me that night, but he did. So the same thing had happened to him and his wife a few years before. We sat and visited and talked all the way back home, and he shared with me different things as we had ridden over them, thankfully. Got to ride back with him. It was Sunday night, March the 19th, 1972. I've always been the restless sort. Never liked to spend much time at home. Elaine says, and I do not remember this, but Elaine says that I came home the next day from work, and I was usually looking for an excuse to leave. Go see some of the boys, see if any of them already had some beer on ice. Didn't make a difference, it was Monday. I came home and sat down on the couch after finding my Bible wherever it was. And I sat down and I opened my Bible. And Elaine uses this in her testimony. She said, I opened my Bible. Gosh, I wish I remembered this. I opened my Bible and said, it's good to be home. I never said that in my life. But it was good to be home. And I was home more ways than one. And now I'm closer to being home than I've ever been before. That was Monday. Marty and Everett called me and told me about a Bible study over at Bob and Nancy McHouston's house in Pontotoc. We were living in Verona, so we was only about 20 miles away. And I got fired up about going to Bible study. Didn't know why. I'd never studied it before, but it's time to start, I guess. Elaine didn't want to go. Well, that night at Bob McHouston's house, in the middle of the study, Elaine blurted out, I realize I am nothing without Jesus. And everybody just kind of scattered to the edge of the room. And Elaine sat down on the piano bench with Bob McHouston. He led her to the Lord in his living room. March the 21st, 1972. I'm big on dates. And so we're going to celebrate another birthday Tuesday night. And so we're just 2 days apart spiritually. She's light years ahead of me spiritually. Truth of the matter. But God did a miraculous thing in my life. He took the desire for alcohol away. He started working on me. I'm way behind where his plans were for me to be at this time, I think, but he's been faithful and he's been good. And I would not have known for sure the date had it not been for Google. I hate to admit that. I hate to admit that. I told Elaine, I said, I'm just not sure where it's 17th or 19th. She said, well, look it up. And I said, how do you do that? She showed me, and I looked it up, and it said that, I always thought it was the 17th. And she said, no, according to this, I looked it up, it said March 17th was a Friday. I said, well, I know it's the 19th. But it doesn't make any difference what day it was. The fact is, it happened. It's a point in time. It's not a process. You don't get, your sanctification is a process, goes on and on and on the rest of your life. But salvation, it happens at a point in time. Your spiritual birth, your physical birth have a whole lot in common. It kind of happens right now. And there may be some pain in front of it. Usually there's a lot of pain in front of it. But I'm celebrating my birthday today. Now, May the 4th's coming. That ain't no big deal. Yesterday, and Floyd and I talked about this, and I know my time, I've already used my time. That miracles, most people don't believe in miracles. You ask the person, they go, no, I don't believe in that. That's just, most people don't believe in miracles until they need one. Then all of a sudden, we need one. Batterson says spiritual maturity is not self-sufficiency. You may be maturing as a Christian, but you're not becoming more self-sufficient. He said, most of us, I hope this fits here somewhere. It fit for me. I went back and reread this early this morning. Our self-sufficient is a subtle working of the sinful nature. He said, it's a desire to get to a place where we don't need God. The disciples' prayer, the Lord's Prayer says, give us this day our daily bread. It didn't say give us this week our daily bread. I need to be in touch with Him every morning. Every day is a new day. He said we want God to provide more, so we need Him less. If He'll provide enough on Monday for the whole week, well, I won't have to be in touch with Him until next Sunday night. I can handle it during the week. It's His provision, but I've got a storehouse back there. Do you know where that thought obviously is a sinful thought, but you know, when I was reading this morning, I said, I've got to share this. God gracefully puts us in situations where enough is not enough. Where did He start doing that? The manna. Old Testament. He provided the manna for Thursday. And some of them would try to, me would be one. I'd want to store a little bit and put it back in on the shelf in the pantry to have a little bit for Friday. And what happened to it? It just rotted. He provides. His mercies are new every morning. Lamentations 3:23. He provides for what we need one day at a time. I cannot save it up. What do we find ourselves in? He says we find ourselves in situations where we need to feed 20,000 people. We only have 2 fish and a few fish and a few barley loaves. The number is not important. So spiritual maturity is not self-sufficiency. Matter of fact, it's the exact opposite. I think the more we mature, the more we know we got to depend on Him today. We've never lived today before. We don't have what we need for today. a week from this morning, early, I'm going to go to Antioch to speak. Mitch has spoken to Antioch. Some of you other fellows may have it there. Tracy, you sang it more, didn't you? And they didn't ask me to stay and sing, but I'm going to go share, and I think I'm going to use some thoughts from Galatians. I'm not real sure. I'm working on it. But I thought in the mid, and I'll give you just about 2 minutes of it, and I promise I'll get out of here. In our growth, we don't need to forget to make sure that our foundation's solid. I followed a guy on the job not long ago, and I didn't see the explosion. That wasn't really an explosion. He built this guy poured a concrete porch on a house and didn't use any steel in it. A lot of concrete. Big porch. Tore down a little bitty porch, built a great big porch, didn't use any steel. I heard about it because I was going to be working on the job and didn't. The guy told me about it and said that this guy's porch fell in. I said, what happened? He said he didn't put any steel in it. We need to make sure that there's steel. And that book right there we commonly call the Word of God is the steel. Make sure it's in our foundation. You can put up anything you want to. It may look nice and everything, but there isn't any foundation. You don't have anything. The sucker's going to crumble and fall. And his did. He had to dig it all out and rebuild it. I don't know how much money he lost on that. We need to make sure that the Spirit of Christ, the power of the risen Christ, is our foundation. And it's our steel. It's what holds us together. As we work on sanctification, growing in Christ, let's make sure that our foundation stays strong. So I think I'm going to take about 15 minutes next week and talk about justification. First of all, I promised you 2 minutes. I lied, Mark. Make sure that you know that you know that you know. 1 John 5:13 is the first verse I memorized after 2 Corinthians 5:17. These things have I written unto you that believe on the name of the Son of God. That's he's writing to the Christian. That believe on the name of the Son of God, that you may know that you have. Not hope so, maybe so. I may hope it doesn't rain tomorrow, but that doesn't have anything to do with anything. I need to know today that I know Jesus. That if he comes today, I'm prepared to go. Now, I'm not ready to go. I'm enjoying life. But that I'm prepared to go. Because he's going to come at an hour when we think not. We will not be thinking about it when it happens, but he is going to come back. And I may go before the coming back. I kind of have a feeling that Elaine and I wasted our money on those 2 plots up at Henry Cemetery. We got 2 lots bought, up there. She's got one over here, and I got one over here. No, they're together. I hope we did. I hope we did. I'm prepared to go. The question is, are you prepared to go? Make sure you got the rebar in the foundation, and then we'll go ahead and build. Trust God, lead you in ways that will sanctify you and make you more like Jesus. I love you. I thank you for the extra time this morning.